Hello and welcome to The Fairy Folk, the podcast that takes you on a magical tour to discover the myth and the magic of the United Kingdom without leaving the comfort of your own home. Today we're travelling to the North York Moors, a national park situated in North Yorkshire. The moors are famous for their stunning countryside vistas. Bram Stoker, William Wordsworth and Lewis Carroll are all thought to have written literature inspired by this beautiful area. And so, no doubt, there is also a wonderful array of local folklore for us to discover. Just over half an hour north of Farndale is the quaint Skinningrove village. The village was known for its fishing and agriculture before the opening of the Skinningrove steelworks in the 1800s. Today, the town is famous for its elaborate 5th of November bonfires, a tradition that has been celebrated there since 1982. But our story today is set long before the bonfire tradition began, or the steelworks were even built, back when Skinningrove was a quiet fishing village. The fishermen tugged at the net as the weight of the unseen creature below thrashed and pulled. Could another pesky basking shark have gotten tangled in their net? Or perhaps another short fin? It certainly seemed much stronger and more agile than anything they had captured before. And it took the combined efforts of all of the fishermen aboard to eventually heave the sopping net up and onto the deck. The bundles splashed to the floor, and the men stood aside to catch their breaths and get a proper glimpse at what they had just reeled in. Well, it was no basking shark, that was for sure. Amongst the wriggling bass and cod was what looked like a face, a human face, staring back at them. The men were startled but quickly leapt to work. Netting was tugged away and sea creatures flung aside as the men pulled a quivering man out from amongst the fish, his eyes wide with fear and amazement. Never before had the Skinningrove fishermen come across something like this. They tried to tell the man that he was okay, that they had saved him from what surely would have been his watery grave, but his eyes still bulged and darted around like the writhing fish beside him. Back on land, the fishermen were joined by many excited villagers, each of them eager to see the man who had come from the sea. They placed him in an old house that had been empty for years, and so that became both the man's refuge and prison. For though this home was now temporarily his, he was kept under careful watch and was not allowed to leave, for the villagers were yet to know exactly who, or indeed what, they were dealing with. A young woman from one of the nearby houses came to visit the man in his new dwelling, and though it had been some time since he was pulled from the waves, he still had a look about him that was wild and windswept, as if he had been rescued that very morning. The woman handed over a basket of fish that her family had carefully prepared for him. He grinned wildly and gratefully accepted the gift, and at once began to feast upon the raw fish, with a hunger that suggested he had not eaten in some time. Soon, many other curious guests came by with a variety of different gifts. Breads, pies and sweetmeats were all offered up to the man, but he shook his head and refused to eat anything except the raw fish that had been gifted to him. He ate without knife or fork, greedily savouring every bite. The villagers had no problem keeping the man well fed, as fishing was their trade, and there was plenty to go around. And though the man seemed appreciative of their generosity, he was unable to speak, except for in strange wails and shrieks, unlike anything one would imagine to come from the throat of a human being. Many of the fair maidens of Skinningrove would gather at the man's door, marvelling at his humble smile and wild hair that messily grazed his shoulders. His eyes lit up when he saw the women gathering outside, and he gazed longingly back at them through the window pane, just as mesmerised by the women as they were by him. The man from the sea became a popular figure in the community, and though he could not speak, he was always patient and kind, and the villagers were equally fascinated and charmed by him. Eventually, the decision was made for the constant watch on his house to be retired, and the lock on his door removed. He was free. Though he had enjoyed his time amongst the Skinningrove villagers, the call of the sea was far too strong to resist, and so, one morning, he left his cottage and headed down towards the shore, gliding through the village as if in a trance. A few of the locals noticed the man as he passed by, but not one of them tried to interrupt him, as his eyes were wild and glazed in a way that they dared not interfere with. And finally he reached the shore and screeched blissfully as the cold waves embraced him. He swam gracefully out towards the horizon, but paused for just a moment to take a final glimpse at the Skinningrove shore and the small crowd that had formed on the beach. The villagers, despite everything, had shown themselves to be kind, and for that, the man was grateful. And so he gave them one last look and a gleaming smile before he turned and dived down, back beneath the waves from which he had come. So that was the story of the Skinningrove Merman. This version was based on John Graves' account in 1808's The History of Cleveland in the North Riding of the County of York, and once again Folktales from the North York Moors by Peter N. Walker. It seems that the first recorded version of the Skinningrove Merman is from a Mr. Wells in 1535, who, when retelling the story, was concerned about just how truthful people would find his account, but he swore that the events had happened just as described. Interestingly, there aren't many alternative versions of this story. Mr. Graves' retelling in particular is rather short and sweet, and it definitely feels more like an anecdote that had been passed down to him, rather than a traditional fully formed folktale, so I hope you'll forgive a little artistic license in my own retelling. But essentially, an unknown man is said to have washed up on the Skinningrove shore, refused to eat anything but raw fish, and could not speak to the locals, and then he disappeared back into the sea, never to be seen again. There actually isn't any proper information on what the man looked like either. I imagined him to be a kind of shipwrecked man, dazed and confused by what was happening to him. But there's no real description of his appearance, and whether he was a merman in the traditional sense, or more human or even fish-like. Perhaps this man was actually a shipwrecked sailor from abroad, unable to communicate properly with the English villagers. In 2012, a man named Jose Salvador Alvarenga supposedly survived 14 months lost at sea on his fishing boat, eating raw fish and other sea creatures to keep him going. So the idea is not completely unheard of. It doesn't, however, explain the ending of the story, where the man desperately escapes the village and returns to the sea. A 1907 article in the Pall Mall Gazette claims that the Skinningrove Merman was actually a tame seal, although it does seem strange that the seasoned fishermen were unable to recognize a seal, particularly as they're often spotted along the coast of the North York Moors. Could this be a case of another shape-shifting selkie, like our Scottish friends from Duncansby Head? So, what do you think? Did the Skinningrove fishermen really capture a merman in their net that day? I'll let you make up your own mind on that one. I love merfolk stories, so I really enjoyed retelling the Skinningrove tale, particularly because it features a merman, which is a rare sighting amongst many of the United Kingdom's folktales that mainly feature their female counterparts. That's all from the North York Moors, I'm afraid, but I hope you've enjoyed today's journey. Goodbye!